So we have some budget pain in Alberta and finger pointing at federal politicians. We have Western alienation, leadership question marks, lots to cover with our panel of party commentators. Susan Smith is a Liberal commentator. Tim Powers is a Conservative commentator, and joining us from Toronto today is Tom Parkin, an NDP commentator. It's good to see you all.
Nice to see you.
Susan, let me start with you. We see this Alberta budget now, and we know there's almost $3 billion in spending cuts for the people of Alberta. And we have Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, pointing the finger at the federal politicians, saying in some ways, at least partly to blame, unfriendly federal policies and an unfriendly federal minority parliament now. And I want to get you to start by telling us how do you think Jason Kenney is playing this issue and these divisions in the country?
Well, I think Jason Kenney's mantra for the next little while is going to be blame the feds. Doesn't matter what it is, blame the feds. That's what it will be. He came in as Premier not very long ago, and he inherited a situation in the province of Alberta that was not created by the federal government. It was probably exacerbated by the fact that a pipeline hasn't been built to Tidewater yet, but the federal government is not responsible for global oil prices. So, but it's easiest for him to have someone to kick Ottawa. That's a good way to be. People are upset. There's definitely Western alienation. This is something that the federal government is going to have to deal with. People are hurting because they haven't got jobs out there. But it's something that the Confederation is going to have to work on together.
Tim, does Jason Kenney have a case to blame in part federal policies on what's happening in Alberta, the economy and alienation?
Well, look, again, and it's not just Alberta that's saying this, so take the pipelines out of the mix in that debate. Bill C-69, which was something Jason Kenney has rallied against. He's not the only one. There are 9 premiers, I believe, including Dwight Ball, a Liberal premier in Newfoundland and Labrador. They feel that Bill C-69, from their perspectives, demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding about the importance of the resource economy. That doesn't deal with price, as Susan says, but it does deal with a major roadblock provincial governments feel is impeding investment in their jurisdiction. And it's not unusual in Canadian politics to have finger pointing between the feds and the province. I mean, Mr. Trudeau just ended a political campaign where 2 of his main targets were Jason Kenney and Doug Ford. So they all have a little bit of blame to go around.
Which also raises
here.
the interesting issue around timing, that we're getting the
the
Alberta budget 3 days after the election and not during the campaign.
Right.
Tom, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, Mr. Kenney, really, if he was expecting to get his treasury full by a pipeline, I think he's got his timeline wrong, because even if everything went according to the most optimistic schedule, nothing's going to be in the ground paying royalties for a long time. The fact is that Mr. Kenney gave a rather large corporate tax cut away this spring, and now this fall he has a deficit and he wants to have cuts, and he's going to blame somebody else. So, I think Albertans need to look a little closer to home and ask, what are the priorities of Mr. Kenney really?
Can I just add one thing, though, that maybe won't get in this discussion that should about there is
it's in it now.
A broader, well, it is now. A broader element of truth to all of this is what happens in the big oil companies as they look to make investment decisions. I think even the Liberals would acknowledge this to a certain degree, that we've lost what they call a lot of the super major oil companies. Global superpowers are not coming to Canada to the degree that they once were. Now, it's not only just because of regulatory changes and uncertainty, but that is part and parcel of it. Kenney's beating that drum.
So more regulatory,
of those.
more regulatory than the whole pipeline uncertainty.
Well, it's because 69. It's Indigenous consultations, and again, I don't think they're not legitimate, but these are some of the things that super major oil companies are now looking at.
Other than Andrew Scheer, isn't Justin Trudeau Jason Kenney's biggest pipeline ally in
this particular pipeline?
Yes, he is. The other thing I think that's important to talk about is the spending problem that Alberta has, and another revenue issue that Alberta has. It's the only province in the country that doesn't have a GST or an HST, and Mr. Kenney and Albertans historically have refused to do something about that. They also were spending more per capita on people than the other major provinces were, Ontario, etc. So when the times are good in Alberta, governments spend like crazy. When the times are bad in Alberta, they cut like crazy and blame Ottawa. Somewhere along the way, there's probably some middle ground that needs to be achieved. Finally, Mr. Kenney, being of conservative bent, conservatives like smaller government. They like to get out of the way of people, and this gives him an excuse with a foil to be able to do something that's actually
As
ideological.
it did for the Prime Minister in his particular agenda to use Mr. Kenney as an excuse and a foil to push forward his agenda.
Well, and it's not like Tom. It's not like the previous Alberta Premier Rachel Notley was a super friend of Justin Trudeau's either.
No, she was obviously in favor of pipeline development as well, but she wasn't somebody who was in favor of cuts and corporate tax cuts to that result in deficits, that result in cuts to important services like healthcare and education. Listen, there's no reason, Peter. There's no reason that Alberta, as the richest province in our country, shouldn't have the best healthcare and the best education system in our country. It should. It should. And it's shameful that there are cuts coming because the new premier, chooses to give a big tax cut to corporations that isn't paying out.
But it also has a history of balanced budgets largely, and I mean, it's a province that, other than the time of the NDP government, there's not a province that has a history of being okay with running big deficits, right? I mean, there have been some.
But there's two sides to that equation, Peter. There's the revenue side, and Mr. Kenney is cutting the revenue side. So this gets lost in the picture here. That if you cut your revenues, you're going to have deficits. So what's the real situation going on here? Was he really banking on money from a pipeline in this fiscal year? No, that can't be, because there's no way that a pipeline could have been online during this fiscal year. So the story is something different than what Mr. Kenney wants to say.
Let's talk about Saskatchewan and Alberta and the challenges for Justin Trudeau here. Is that anger real? Is it visceral? Is it deep? Or is it a political issue being fanned by Scott Moe and Jason Kenney? And if it's real, how is Justin Trudeau going to get representation now and hear the voices from a province where he doesn't have any members of parliament?
So I think it's a bit of both, actually. There are definitely Albertans and Saskatchewans that are disgruntled. They all went to the polls and they all voted, and the electoral map looks like it does. And not the first time for Canada to have big blocks of different colors in other parts of the country. Democracy is bumpy in Canada, but it works. So yes, there are people there that are unhappy, and they've been unhappy before, and then they've gotten over it, and then it continues to go on. But I do think it's being fanned by senior politicians, and I think that's a dangerous game to play. Either you're in Canada and you're for Canada, or you're not. But Justin Trudeau has challenges. He's got to get some voices in cabinet. He's got to get some voices in his prime minister's office, whether he appoints someone without a seat like Stéphane Dion and Pierre Pettigrew in Quebec, following the constitutional issues and crisis around there. That could be done again. Maybe he puts Randy Boissonnault in cabinet. Maybe Ralph Goodale comes in as the senior advisor.
Tim, where does he go with this? It seems to me that one of the key things that Albertans and people in Saskatchewan are looking for are not just a representative. And I say that in the context: are we past the point here where what they're looking for is someone to be their voice in cabinet? Because I mean,
that's just more than cabinet. I mean, cabinet's there's symbolism to that.
It can't be someone who's bringing the message. That it has to be someone, doesn't it, who's bringing a message of the anger and the hurt out there, as opposed to someone sitting around the table trying to find a way to massage it.
If Justin Trudeau was legitimate in his comments in his press conference yesterday, then he's starting to acknowledge some recognition of that. And it won't, Alberta and Saskatchewan, other provinces won't just accept symbolism. Symbolism's important in politics. Bad symbolism, for example, may be viewed by Alberta and Saskatchewan if Stephen Guilbeault, the prominent environmental activist, is, as some are suggesting, put into the environmental portfolio. I don't think that will go over well, so be watching for that. But back to Susan's point about Western alienation, I think it's more pronounced than it's probably been in 20 years, because this is the most significant, you can cast blame about anywhere, downturn that they've had in Saskatchewan and Alberta in a very long time. And when it's not just about culture, but it's about your wallet and how you put food on the table, people get concerned. And there are lots of people who were once employed in Alberta who aren't now, and Kenney and Moe are facing immediate pressure to address that as the premiers
Tom,
of those provinces.
I'll note for our viewers who have certainly noted themselves, those who are saying, hey, there's no one in the conversation from Alberta or Saskatchewan, but we have talked to a lot of those people. But I'm not sure that I know that that's important, but it's almost as important, isn't it? this is really a message to central Canada. People know what the people of Alberta and Saskatchewan are thinking. They've made that clear. So how does Justin Trudeau have to deal with this?
Well, Peter, I used to live in Regina, and I have a bit of a sense of it from that experience. And it's not simply about pipelines, although that's certainly part of it. It's the feeling that, no matter what you do, you're not heard in Ottawa, and the people in Ottawa don't represent your values, your culture, your ideas, your area. And that's a really bad place to be in.
And in the case, just to point out, in the case, speaking to Scott Moe a couple of days ago, it's like, ask number one is not, I don't want you to hear how I feel anymore about a carbon tax. I want you to get rid of the carbon tax. It's that simple. There's no more trying to figure out how I feel.
But you don't get to issue diktats like that.
I know. I'm saying, but Tom, so it is more than just pipelines. It's the sense that we know what we want in our province, and we think we have the right to implement different kinds of climate change plans, but you're not listening in Ottawa.
Yeah, I think that is the sense, is that Ottawa is not being responsive. In a way, it's not that different than feelings in other parts of the country that Ottawa is not responsive. And that is why Mr. Trudeau only got 33% of the vote. He doesn't appear to be someone other than an Ottawa insider. And that's something he's going to have to work on really hard.
Okay,
and it does matter. It does matter to have a representative in Saskatchewan or Alberta, and somebody who understands and feels the way that they do about not just pipelines, but other issues as well.
Yeah.
I think the Prime Minister is listening and going to be listening. He certainly was sent a message by Canadians, but he was also sent a message by Canadians that climate action, we have to do something.
There are way more votes represented in the House of Commons today that want a carbon tax and ambitious climate change than votes that
Correct. So
Are you
Alberta
assuming that's
can
what
no more.
all those voters want, though, too? That's a dangerous
No, I mean,
thing.
no,
Anyway, go ahead.
But they
each
didn't
of those
vote
parties,
against it, right?
yeah.
They were key planks.
Correct.
And that is an assumption. I give you that.
I think Alberta can no more, or Saskatchewan can no more call the shots on this country than Quebec can, than Ontario, than Atlantic Canada. That's not the way our democracy works. People vote. They create a government. The government has to govern for the entire country and put in policies that work for the entire economy. And just because your guys didn't get in doesn't mean you can tip the game and go home.
Tim, a quick comment.
Yeah,
to you.
I was going to say,
can he make this better, or are we destined for tougher days here?
They all need to make it better, but the Prime Minister has to assume more responsibility for this. You don't go picking fights with premiers and assume in the end that there aren't longer-term consequences. They all need to lift their game.
Okay, Tom.
I hate to agree with the others, but there is a little bit of reap what you sow going on here. When you constantly attack Mr. Ford, and I am not a conservative by any stretch of the imagination, but you're going to get some pushback. So these kind of divisive politics really have to end.
Okay.
And there needs to be some attempt to reach out and find accommodations and ways that people can work together on the things that are common.
All right. Thank you all for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care.